It was July 14th, 1973, at Atlanta's Omni Coliseum. More than 30,000 fans filled every seat, every aisle buzzing with anticipation. Elvis walked out in his shimmering white jumpsuit, rhinestones scattering the spotlight. But midway through Suspicious Minds, a sharp sound cut across the arena. The music faltered. What happened next, no one could have predicted. The night air outside the Omni Coliseum carried the thick, humid heat of a southern July. Inside, it was even heavier, thousands pressed shoulder to shoulder, paper fans swaying, the murmur of expectation rising to a roar whenever a spotlight swept the stage. Ushers tried to control the flow, but the sheer size of the crowd, estimated at 30,000, gave the evening a restless energy. People had traveled from across Georgia, some clutching homemade signs that read Elvis Forever or The King Lives. Vendors hurried through the aisles with sodas and popcorn, their voices barely audible over the chant that built from the rafters. "We want Elvis." Backstage, the Stamps Quartet tuned their voices. Bass singer J.D. Sumner chuckled nervously, whispering to a security guard named Earl when he steps out there, "The roof's gonna come off." Earl nodded, gripping his walkie-talkie, scanning the endless sea of bodies. Even he, tasked with keeping order, could not deny the anticipation that rippled like electricity through the building. And then it happened. The house lights dimmed. The first notes of Also Sprach Zarathustra thundered from the speakers, a now iconic prelude. The audience surged to their feet as if pulled by a single wire. The curtain parted, and Elvis strode forward in his dazzling white jumpsuit, the rhinestones scattering light in every direction. He waved, a sly smile at the corner of his mouth, before gripping the microphone with practiced ease. The screams reached a pitch so high the band nearly lost their beat. The King launched into his opening number, voice steady, hips swaying with the rhythm. Every movement drew applause. Every pause brought shrieks, from the cheap seats in the rafters to the front row pressed against the stage. People swore they could feel his presence directly. Have you ever felt the weight of 30,000 eyes resting on you, expecting magic? That night, Elvis bore it all with apparent ease. But even legends carry human vulnerabilities. No one in that arena could. Imagine how fragile even the King's wardrobe could be. The first half hour of the show unfolded like a dream. Elvis moved effortlessly from song to song, each transition greeted with fresh waves of applause. Burning love lit the crowd on fire, arms swaying like a sea of torches. Then came Suspicious Minds, the anthem that always demanded his full energy. The horns blared, the bass thumped. Elvis leaned forward, the sweat shining on his brow under the hot stage lights. The band locked into rhythm. But just as momentum peaked, a sudden, foreign sound cut through the music sharp, tearing, unmistakable. The brass section stumbled for half a beat. Elvis froze for a fraction of a second. Then the crowd's noise fractured into pockets of gasps and whispers. There it was, a jagged tear at the seam of his jumpsuit, right along his thigh. The brilliant white fabric, stretched from his dramatic lunge, had given way in front of tens of thousands. For a moment, the arena went dead silent. The Stamps Quartet looked at each other, J.D. Sumner biting down on a laugh, his shoulders shaking as he tried to mask it with a cough. Security guard Earl glanced up at the stage, already preparing in his mind for the worst would Elvis storm off. Would the show end abruptly? The spotlight only magnified the mishap. Every sequin glimmered except where the rip carved an unmissable shadow. The musicians, Trained professionals pressed on with the song, but their eyes darted nervously toward their leader. How would you react, standing center stage, if a single accident threatened to undo not just a song, but the aura of perfection your fans believed in? Would you laugh it off, or would the weight of embarrassment crush you? Fans near the front covered their mouths. A woman in the third row whispered, "Oh no," to her husband, who only shook his head in disbelief. Somewhere in the back, nervous giggles escaped, quickly stifled by neighbors. The uncertainty hung heavier than the summer heat. Elvis's hand twitched toward the rip. Instinctive, but he stopped himself. To fumble now would only draw more attention. He stood still for a second, microphone lowered, letting the band carry the line. His eyes darted briefly toward Charlie Hodge, his friend and rhythm guitarist, who gave a quick nod of encouragement. The song teetered on the edge of collapse. The audience balanced between sympathy and second-hand embarrassment. Every eye in that arena locked on the white fabric that had just betrayed. Horns carried on, filling the void, but the atmosphere had shifted. What seconds before had been pure awe now trembled with uncertainty. The crowd of 30,000 leaned forward collectively, waiting, wondering. Even the ushers, who had been too busy to glance at the stage, now stood still, their trays of popcorn forgotten. A wardrobe malfunction in front of such a vast audience threatened to shatter the illusion of invincibility. Earl, the security guard, positioned near the stairs to the stage, muttered into his radio, "Be ready, in case he walks off." The tension in his voice betrayed what everyone feared, that this might end the concert too soon. Elvis stood still, the spotlight pouring over him, the tear in his jumpsuit visible to anyone with a clear line of sight. A ripple of giggles escaped from a corner section. Others hushed them instantly, almost protective of the man they had come to adore. There was an unspoken question in the air. Would the king of rock and roll allow himself to be undone by a stitch of fabric? Charlie Hodge, strumming lightly to maintain rhythm, caught Elvis's eye again. He gave a look that said, "It's your moment. Decide." The musicians behind him shuffled uneasily, unsure if they should vamp or cut the song short. Even J.D. Sumner pressed his microphone closer to his lips but hesitated to add his booming bass, waiting on Elvis's signal. What would you do if thousands were watching, their emotions hanging on your next gesture? Would you let humiliation sink would you gamble on humor to save the night? The audience seemed split. A teenager in the balcony whispered, "This is it. He's gonna leave." But down front, a woman clutched her Elvis scarf and whispered to her friend, "He won't stop. He never does." The contrast, fear versus faith, built like a tide threatening to break. Seconds stretched. The hush was louder than any scream. The omnipresent background hum of 30,000 people had disappeared into fragile silence. Even the sound of Elvis adjusting his grip on the microphone stand seemed amplified. Security tensed. Musicians waited. The audience held its breath. And then, the smallest sign of life. Elvis tilted his head just slightly, that mischievous smile beginning to flicker at the edge of his lips. His eyes sparkled beneath the lights. He raised the microphone slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the tension itself. The cliffhanger now was not the torn seam, but the question of choice. Would he shrink into the mistake, or would he transform it? Then Elvis reached for the microphone with a grin that changed everything. The grin widened. Elvis let the silence hang for a heartbeat longer, milking the suspense. Then, with perfect timing, He leaned into the microphone and spoke in a playful drawl that carried across the cavernous arena. "Well, folks, looks like this suit wasn't built for karate." The words landed like lightning. For half a second, there was stunned quiet, then the dam broke. The entire audience erupted into laughter, a roar so loud it rattled the rafters. Ushers doubled over with relief. Earl, the security guard, slapped his leg, shaking his head in disbelief. J.D. Sumner's booming laugh carried through the microphone, becoming part of the performance itself. Elvis didn't stop there. He tugged at the rip with exaggerated drama, as if putting it on display, and winked at the front row. The band, sensing the change, slid into playful riffs, horns punctuating his joke like a comedy soundtrack. Suddenly, what had threatened to be a disaster became a stage bit, owned and reframed by the king himself. He paused, smiled, spoke. Laughter erupted again. The rhythm of his short sentences turned the accident into a performance. Even people in the farthest balcony felt they were in on a private joke. Isn't it true that sometimes humor is the bravest choice? By laughing first, he gave permission for everyone else to laugh with him, not at him. What might have been ridicule transformed instantly into admiration. Fans wiped tears of laughter from their eyes. A woman in the third row shouted, "We love you anyway." The chant spread, echoing across sections until thousands of voices were repeating it. The energy had shifted, completely no longer tense, but joyous, bonded by one shared absurd moment. The king leaned on the microphone stand, catching his breath between laughs, and quipped, "Guess I'll need a bigger tailor." The crowd roared once more, their affection renewed and even stronger than before. But the story didn't end with laughter. It transformed into something bigger. The ripple of laughter became a wave of connection. Elvis, sensing the energy, didn't rush back into the song. Instead, he leaned down from the stage as fans stretched their arms forward, scarves and flowers extended like offerings. One woman tossed a bright red scarf toward him. He caught it in midair, twirled it around his hand, then tied it loosely around his waist, right over the torn seam. The gesture drew a thunderous cheer, louder than the opening fanfare of the night. What could have been embarrassment turned into theater. Elvis turned slowly on stage, striking a mock-heroic pose, as if the scarf were a soldier's belt. The spotlight glinted off the rhinestones that remained intact, but the rip, now covered by a fan's gift, seemed transformed into a badge of resilience. A teenage boy in the front row waved a hand-painted sign, "We love you, jumpsuit or not." The camera flashes caught it, immortalizing a moment of humor and devotion. Elvis pointed at the boy, gave him a wink, and the entire section erupted in applause. Isn't it remarkable how quickly strangers can become a community when bound by one story, one shared mishap? Could a single mistake forge a bond stronger than perfection ever could? The chant swelled. Elvis, Elvis. But now the sound was different, not just adoration, but solidarity. They weren't cheering for a flawless icon. They were cheering for a man who could stumble, laugh, and still command a stage with grace. Charlie Hodge stepped up with his guitar, grinning from ear to ear, and strummed the intro again. Elvis adjusted the scarf dramatically, as if suiting up for battle, then launched back into Suspicious Minds. The crowd, now fully engaged, sang along with more power than before, their voices rising to fill the gaps left by the earlier silence. That night, the arena transformed. It was no longer 30,000 individuals staring at a performer. It became a family laughing together, singing together, carrying the memory of a shared joke that had erased embarrassment and replaced it with joy that night. The audience left with more than music, they left with a story. The following morning, Atlanta newspapers carried headlines that skipped past the set list and went straight to the wardrobe mishap. Elvis splits his suit, wins the crowd read one column, accompanied by grainy black and white photos snapped from the balcony. Reporters described how 30,000 people had laughed and cheered in unison, calling it one of the most human moments of Presley's career. Bootleg tapes circulated quickly. Fans who had smuggled cassette recorders into the arena passed copies among friends, whispering, "This is the night he tore his jumpsuit." The sound of the crowd's laughter, followed by Elvis's line about karate, became a cult artifact, cherished precisely because it wasn't planned. At Graceland years later, visitors would point to a jumpsuit with a stitched seam on display and ask, "Was this the one from Atlanta?" Guides would smile knowingly, explaining that some torn costumes had indeed been repaired and preserved, living relics of nights when imperfection became part of the show. Why do we remember flaws more vividly than perfection? Perhaps because flaws reveal the person behind the legend. A flawless performance may dazzle, but a stumble that ends in laughter lives forever in the heart. J.D. Sumner was later quoted in an interview, recalling the night with a chuckle. The brass section nearly missed their notes because they were laughing so hard. But Elvis, he had them right back in the palm of his hand within seconds. Even Earl, the serious security guard, told friends it was the first time he'd ever seen an entire crowd cheer louder for a mistake than for a song. Fans who had been there retold the story to children and grandchildren. How they saw the king laugh at himself, how the whole arena felt like family for a few minutes. Each retelling added to the legend, ensuring the night was never forgotten, and the legend of the split suit kept growing in the end. The story of that night in Atlanta wasn't about a torn seam or a fleeting joke. It was about grace under pressure, the kind that turns mishaps into memories. Elvis stood before 30,000 people and chose laughter over shame, connection over retreat. That choice changed the arc of the evening, transforming a near disaster into one of the most beloved moments of his touring. Years. Imperfections have a way of revealing truth. The king's dazzling jumpsuit had split, but the man wearing it reminded the world that strength isn't in flawless fabric, it's in the courage to laugh at yourself. When the crowd cheered louder after the mishap than before it, they weren't just celebrating a singer. They were celebrating humanity. Have you ever found that the cracks in your own story became the very moments people cherished most? Elvis's rip reminded us all that sometimes vulnerability binds us closer than perfection ever could, because sometimes the loudest cheers come after the smallest cracks. If this story moved you, share it with someone who could use the reminder that mistakes don't define us, they connect us. Were you or someone you know ever at an Elvis concert? Tell us your memory in the comments. And for more legendary moments like this, don't forget to subscribe and watch the next story.